Hello, my name is April, and I'm the host of the history podcast, Dorky. Dorky is two words, door and key. It's a play on the word dorky, which is really fitting because I'm a dork who loves to talk about history and random events and people from history. So come join me as I dive into these events and people. From Ötzi the Iceman to Studio 54, I cover it all in a way that's easy to consume. Get ready to hear a new and different perspective and gain a deeper understanding of the past while having some fun along the way. Welcome to Dorky. You can find and subscribe to Dorky anywhere you listen to podcasts, and Dorky is on all social medias as Dorky Pod, so be sure to check all of that out as well. Talk to you soon, friends.
Hi there, welcome to Not Your Average Goat. I'm your host, Tisha Gillespie, and this is a show that celebrates all the shapes, sizes, and colors of diversity as well as adversity. Through authentic conversations, we hope to have an impact on dismantling societal stigma while creating a place for relatable storytelling. I'm so excited to have you here, though, and I'm really appreciate you taking out some time to talk to me, especially so early on a Monday morning.
Hey, that's okay. I am much better in the mornings, and the later it gets in the day, the worse I get. My brain is good. I'm definitely a morning person. So yeah, this is great. Thank you for having me.
Of course, I am the same. I joke with people telling them, do not schedule a meeting after 4 p.m. Eastern. That's the latest. Otherwise, you might get a very snarky, irritable Tisha.
Yeah. This is how I feel with anyone that wants me to coach them in the evenings. I'm like, I just want to warn you that daytimes are best for me. And if I will do it maybe twice a week and that's it. Because I'm like, the evenings, my brain is spent. I don't have any bandwidth left to talk with anyone about anything specific, but I do have one client who I coach in the evenings right now. And he's a big, a deep thinker, and it makes it so much easier because he thinks so deeply that he kind of ends up coaching himself, which is amazing.
One thing I love to do with the folks I bring on the show, Megan, is to time travel a bit, because I think it's so interesting to kind of look at where you are today, but then to reflect on where you were as a child. So if you think back to let's say 7, 8-year-old Megan, who was she? What were your passions? What were you into? Do you see yourself being different from yourself today?
Oh, it's funny because growing up, I always played teacher I made my brother be my student. And I think I remember playing this even before I was, I'm sure I was 7 or 8 because I had to be in school to know some of this. But I remember I was really into the idea that I wanted to make bulletin boards. Apparently I thought that's what teachers did, was make bulletin boards and do all of this cool crafty stuff. But I was definitely always played teacher. I taught swimming lessons. I did all of these things growing up. And then I ended up being a teacher for a long time. So I do feel like part of my coaching, there's an initial teaching portion of it, and then it moves into more coaching and allowing people to think for themselves, and really process what they're thinking and why they're thinking it so that we can get to the bottom of it. So coaching is obviously asking, the right questions and letting people figure out what they're thinking. But really getting into that process of saying, okay, now let's pay attention to what happens when you think that. There's so much intersection between teaching and coaching that I think I am doing the same thing, just in a different format.
It's great when you can kind of see that through line through your entire life and just how everything connects. And even if it's not the exact same thing, just being able to kind of connect those dots and say, yes, I completely understand how I made it from here to here.
Yeah.
So you're currently located in Indiana. Is that where you grew up?
I did. I live in the same town I grew up in, which
That's
is
awesome.
Equal parts really nice and also really kind of sad. So yes, I love it. I am really close with my parents and they only live a couple miles from me. And and I love that. My dad will text me every Friday at about 2:30 or 3 o'clock and just send me a little wine emoji. And he's like, "Hey, it's Friday. Are you coming over to have wine with me and with your mom?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course I am. It's Friday." So I do. I go over and I have a glass of wine with my parents on Friday evenings and I love it. Like we joke around. I love having that. And then there's also part of me that always wonders, like, what would it be like if I would have moved somewhere? Like I can't really, I don't know. I mean, I could only guess. And it's a funny thing for me because you said 7 or 8, which is so funny because 8 was about when I started getting really anxious. And I don't know how much of it, I mean, I'm assuming a large portion of why I live where I live is because I was so anxious for so many years that maybe this was comfortable and this was safe and my parents were my safe place. So I stayed here. But maybe that's the way it was supposed to end up because who knows if I would be doing what I'm doing if I didn't do all of that. And I certainly don't regret growing up with my grandparents close and my parents close and I love that. But I also have this thing where I'm like, man, I would love to live in Nashville. My cousin just moved to Nashville. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to live outside. I don't want to live in the sticks because I kind of live in a really rural town right now anyway. But I love that city. And I love Carlsbad, California. And I love Boston and all these places that I'm like, I wonder what that would be like to live in a place that was big because I don't live in a big place. I live in a tiny little rural town.
Well, hey, I mean, firstly, you still have time to, live
I
somewhere
do.
else
I
eventually if
do.
you do. But it sounds like right now you have a really, really solid foundation and a really loving community of family
Hmm.
around you, that's always so nice to, I think, kind of have that support and just that community. And I love that your dad texts you on Friday afternoons is like, hey, when are we having wine?
Yeah, it's the best. It really is the best.
That's so
I mean,
cool.
yes, I have a dad date every weekend. And my mom is there too. I say my mom, but my mom never texts me. She always acts like she's surprised that I'm there. And I'm like, it's Friday. This is what we do on Friday.
What's your go-to wine?
I love cab. I'm cab. Like I'm a dry red.
Me too. Yeah,
Yeah.
the bigger the bolder the better.
Uh-huh. And in Indiana, we have tons of wineries, but they're all sweet wines and I just can't do it. I want to. Like I would like a wine slushy if it was 90 degrees out, but mostly I just want the dry red.
Well, you kind of talked about, your family life right now. When you reflect back on like your upbringing and, you mentioned you have your brother, what did that look like for you?
I was very lucky, very blessed in the family department. I have a ton of cousins and I have 2 brothers. I'm the oldest of the 3 of us. And my brothers are exact opposites in every way. So I was kind of the one that was like the mediator between the two, which I suppose is a traditional oldest daughter role.
Yeah, I'm the oldest
But
daughter too.
yeah, so the oldest daughter, we're like the hands apart. Okay, boys, stop. But yeah, we all really, even though the boys are very different, we get along so well. And so I think just growing up and knowing that it was just this running joke. I had a lot of first cousins and second cousins. And because there were so many of us and because we were all born in the same area, we kind of went to school together. So it was fun to be like, oh, I'm hanging out with this person who is one of my best friends, but they also happen to be like my second cousin. And then so it was just like that a lot. I mean, I think my town is weird in a sense that I don't imagine that it's this way for most people, at least in the United States, because people tend to, I just have this thought where like people tend to move away and they move to other places. And that just wasn't my experience. My grandfather had a really successful business here and my dad had a really successful business that, I mean, they both had expanded. It wasn't just like a one brick and mortar. My dad owned like 15 insurance agencies and my grandfather was a banker. And so it was a thing where we stayed here because this is where our roots were. And now people have started to move away. My oldest son and one of my brothers lives down near Indy. My other brother lives in Fort Wayne, but still just within mostly like an hour or so away. And that's true for my cousins too. But it really was a great way to grow up and know that your family was also kind of like your friends. But then also the friends that I have, like I had some really tight friends and it's so fun now. Like one of my best friends from high school lives in LA. And so if I go to LA, I have somebody to hang out with. And it's like we just pick up, just like I just saw her not very long ago. So it's just really, I think in terms of my family, I feel very lucky to not have that feeling where I need to get away from them or escape them. I don't have that feeling at all.
That's amazing. I love
Mhm.
that so much. And,
Yeah.
I came from a really big family myself. And so I
Hmm.
have six sisters.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And so I kind of feel like, and we're kind of spread out in age, so not all of
Hmm.
them, but I kind of feel like I grew up with built-in friends. I just
Yeah.
always had that. So, I mean, in very kind of, a little different from your situation, but I can definitely relate to just, going out and just having all of your family be your friends in a way. And,
Yeah.
now as adults, my sisters and I, especially the ones who are closer in age to me, we don't physically see each other all the time because I live about 2 hours from them. So not terribly far. It didn't go too far.
Hmm.
But we're definitely, it's really nice because we can kind of reflect on, share childhood stories and just, actually talk now
Yeah.
as adults and we go to each other to get advice. And it's just so cool because I also was just a person who I'm an introvert.
Hmm.
We'll get into this too when we talk about your journey, but I also struggle with anxiety. And so
Hmm.
for me, I was never that person that had like 50 friends at school. I maybe
Hmm.
had one or two really good friends. And when I got a friend, I would hold on to them for several years. And then if we separated or kind of drifted apart, then I would find another friend and then we would be friends. And it would just be like one or maybe two at a time.
Yeah. It is nice to know that. I mean, really, my brothers and I, they're my friends now. And I
Mhm.
even lived, my brother, who's just the closest in age to me, he and I both went to Purdue. And so he was always, I think I was a freshman and he was a senior, or maybe I was a junior, or no, I was a senior and he was a freshman. And maybe I was a junior and he was a freshman. But he, when he went down there, he's like, I'm just going to live with you. And I was like, yeah, of course you are. And it was great. Like we got along. It was fun. I lived with him for a year in college and then I graduated and he went and lived with his friends. But it was never a thing like, no, God, why no? You're not living with me. I'm like, of course you're living with me. You're my brother. We're going to have fun. This is going to be great.
Well, Megan, you kind of talked about this already. So you ended up going and becoming a teacher for 20 years, and you worked at a school with children who were experiencing at-risk circumstances. And so you kind of talked about young Megan, wanting to design bulletin boards, but I'm curious to know, was that kind of, the big connector for you when it came to teaching, or was there something else there that kind of helped kind of, cultivate that passion for you?
I would love to know the answer to that question. I would tell I would tell anyone who thought they were going to go into teaching because they got to make cool bulletin boards. That is not it. It was one of those things where I'm like, you're kidding me. You think I have time to do the bulletin board? Um, I really always just, it came natural. I mean, it's very easy for me. Teaching is easy. And even though I mean, you could give me a subject that I don't know anything about. And if you gave me time to just dig into it, I could teach it to someone. Teaching is just a very natural thing for me to do. I can teach. I used to say that I can teach anybody to do anything. And now I'm going to say I can coach anybody to do anything because that intersection between just digging into people's brains and find out what's going on in there and then saying, okay, this is what we have to do to understand it makes sense to me, which I guess, I mean, without understanding that, I certainly didn't understand that when I was playing school when I was a little girl, but I must have, I must have, and I just didn't know why. Because even after I was done playing school and I was a lifeguard, I was a swimmer and then I was a lifeguard because that just seems like the best job ever. And I already could swim. So I would go there, and then I was teaching swimming lessons because I worked at the pool, and that's what lifeguards did. And it was easy for me to teach that. And I think with that caveat that it's really easy for me to teach that, I can also say that my planning, like the detail portion of my brain, doesn't love it because it's hard for me sometimes to sit down and write down those plans. Like making lesson plans to me is a surefire way to fail and to mess up because I don't stick with that necessarily exactly what I wrote down all the time. My brain's a little more free flowing than that. And I think that when I think about going back into teaching, it's something that I can feel a lot of resistance to. It's not something that I want to do. I think that my time in the classroom is done. And I think that teaching, a lot of times when we say, oh, you're a teacher, and immediately people's brains go because you work in a school or because you do those things. And yes, I did that for a long time. But now when I think about it, I don't picture myself in a classroom anymore. I don't want that sort of teaching. And in terms, it's interesting that you ask this because even this morning I was journaling. So I always do a little bit of like journaling in the morning and some like Bible study stuff in the morning. And I sat down and I'm like, why do I keep feeling like I'm pulled back to teenagers when like my last teaching, when I was teaching in high school, which was great job. I mean, it really was a good job, but I was just over it. And when I think about going back to working with teenagers again, there's part of me that absolutely adores teenagers. I mean, I'm raising a slew of them in my own house, but I also am like, I don't want necessarily the teenagers. I think there's a certain classification of teenagers that I do want to work with. I want the ones that are very goal-oriented and motivated and want to move forward, who also feel anxious, but I want to teach those kids how to maybe not feel anxious now, as opposed to teaching them history and government, which is what I taught for the last probably 8 to 10 years.
What challenges did you run into? And I imagine they were probably, maybe somewhat the same, but also very different too, just knowing that you were dealing with a different group of students.
The kids that I taught very early on, as opposed to the kids that I still am in there 2 mornings a week with them, just teaching, like doing credit recovery and things like that. I just go in to help out a little bit. And I think just looking at the kids and how much, not that teenagers have changed, but how much the climate of education has changed, and also how much, I mean, teenagers' brains obviously are functioning in very much the same way. They're still teenagers. They still have typical teenage behaviors. But I think that seeing the level of like their challenges, the things that they are dealing with right now in the world that we're living in, that has escalated. That is so much higher. There's so much more out there that they're trying to navigate. Social media in itself, I could preach about this forever. It is literally killing our kids. And it's reflected in the amount of respect that teachers get in the classroom. It shows up in, I had a student recently who his dad said, if you're going to take his phone away, he's not coming back to school until you let him have it in the classroom. Like, he will have his phone. It is his phone. And we were finally like, well, just no. But the kid was gone for a month. And his dad was finally, he was furious. He's like, you can't tell my kid not to have their phone. But then they're on their phones all the time and they're not paying attention. And they know that they can AI all the answers and they know they can Google anything, but they're not just using it to learn. They're also using it to bully kids because it's there and they know so much that it does make them more anxious. But I think that that's also true for adults. We're not just seeing it in teenagers. We're seeing a byproduct of what their parents are experiencing as well. We do see parents who are saturated with so much information that's making them anxious, that's making them more defiant and on edge because they're very defensive and they're very much like, you can't tell me what to do. It's almost like this Lord of the Flies situation where it's everyone for themselves. and we're so connected, so disconnected, but the kids are running the show and the teachers aren't, and the administrators are not. And I think that's my biggest struggle. And I see it even with my own two kids who are in just our local public school system, where they're like, oh no, it's like savage out there. Like the teachers and the administrators are kind of in a stuck place right now. It's a really hard place to be right now. I do think specifically for the students that I taught at that alternative school, it was a lot of bigger life circumstances too. These kids are living mostly in survival anyway. They had a lot of abuse, neglect, poverty, and parental loss, whether their parents had passed away or they had left, whatever it was that was happening with them. They had normal human traits that were hard for them. We had kids who were on the spectrum. We had kids who had some really big time ADHD, things that they were working through to try to learn that did affect their behavior that caused them to get in trouble in regular public school. So that in and of itself, knowing that if you have a kid who they don't have any food at their house, they're not going to learn for the day. So we try to feed them first or what happened at home? Well, my dad freaked out and he yelled at me, and then this happened and this happened and this happened. And we have a lot of counselors there who are de-escalating those problems so that the teachers can work. But some days it's a shutdown and you're battling that fight or flight, which, we do that as adults, and we've learned maybe more coping skills than they have, whether they're good coping skills or bad coping skills. But they also, so having teachers trying to teach, but then also having them to try to teach with a kid who is in that brain or in that body is a whole different kind of thing. Because we have most of our kids, that would be almost our entire population on any given day, having some sort of situation like that, as opposed to maybe a regular public school where they had a handful of kids that also were in that place, but just not like everyone in the school. Where ours was pretty much everyone in the school.
I'm curious to get your take on this, Megan. Knowing that there's mental health, there's mental illness and mental disorders, and sometimes the neurology dictates your limitations, and maybe those limitations require treatment of some sorts, whether that's behavioral treatment, whether that's medication. I'm curious to know, though, with all of that in mind, do you think that one opportunity for, maybe thinking about high school students, or even college, would be emotional intelligence courses? I don't feel like I was ever taught that either in my home or at school at all.
I know I was never taught that. I think it has to be integrated into a curriculum. And I think it's something that we're asking, it's such, all of the chaos. We talk about socio-emotional learning and we talk about all of this stuff. Like, what do we teach? What do we not teach? And there's such a horrible misconception about what that actually means right now, where I'm like, we're just asking to help these kids have ways to navigate their feelings and their emotions. We're not telling them who they should be or who they should not be, but just allowing them to feel what they feel is such a thing, is such an important thing that, teachers aren't equipped to do it. They're not equipped to do it. They've got enough problems trying to get kids to do their math. And the more they struggle to get them to do their math, when they're dealing with whether it's a mental health issue or they've got whatever's going on in their life, we know that they're not going to learn that. And so I do think there has to be some level of that, because if we're expecting these kids to meet these higher and higher standards at all times, and we're not teaching them how to deal with the amount of stress that they're experiencing from all of the great things that they have going on in their lives. Going back again to that idea of social media, but the pressure that it puts on kids and the amount of anxiety and mental health issues that puts on kids right now, unless we're going to have some mass regulation from Congress that's going to say, hey, guess what? All of the social media closes like the doctor's office. At 5:00, it's done. You don't get it anymore. And it doesn't come back on until 9 the next morning, unless we're going to do something like that, or just say whatever that regulation would look like. The kids are going to have it in their face 24 hours a day and there's no regulation. So if we come in and we have these kids coming to school and they're dealing with anxiety and they're dealing with stress and they're dealing with bullying and they're dealing with all these things, we have to be able to deal with that in the schools because there's no one else doing it. I mean, we're saturated. We can't get kids into counselors. I know that all the time. I'm working mostly with adults who deal with anxiety. That's kind of like my favorite place to be right now. But every single day I'm getting calls from like parents of teenagers. And that's really, I mean, they need help. The kids need help. The teachers need help. The parents need help because we're just all in this place. But yes, I think really, I don't know how that would be handled, whether it would be something that would be incorporated into teacher training at colleges and universities, or if it would be something that would be school systems. But I do think that teachers have to have some sort of way to teach kids how to regulate their nervous systems, because growing up, when I grew up, I mean, I was an 80s kid. It wasn't even a real thing. And we were anxious, but there was no word for it. There was certainly no diagnosis or explanation. We weren't taught to regulate our emotions. We just went outside and figured out how to do it ourselves. But yeah, I do think that's really important right now, especially where we are with so many kids struggling.
I agree. And I think about, at least for me, fifth grade, seventh grade, and I think in ninth grade, you were forced to take health education and learn about the reproductive system and learn how to prevent STDs. And so why not go after, not just the reproductive system, but go after the neurological system and just help these children, because eventually these children become the adults, and that's why it just perpetuates.
Yeah. And I don't think it has to be anything intensive. My thought, I've given so much, it's so crazy to me that we're having this conversation right now, because this literally has been one of those things pushing its way into my, when things just keep showing up. Yeah. And my thought on that really is that the work that I'm doing right now, so often with adults, is unraveling years of anxious responses and anxious reactions and not knowing. I mean, we are where we are as adults because we didn't know how to do this. So it takes a lot longer. It takes a really long time because our nervous systems have these pathways that have already been formed. And once we dig into it and we understand what's going on, it's not easy, but it's so simple to undo. And kids don't have the number of neural pathways already in place and structured and going strong inside their brains. So if we could teach them when they're younger, hey, that feeling that you have inside your body, that just means you need to take a break, and we just need to let that feeling be there, because it doesn't feel very good, but it's going to go away and everything's going to be fine. That's just called anxiety. And when we feel that, let's just take some breaths and let's remember that we're not allowed to think right now. We're only allowed to feel that feeling. And if we can do that with a kindergartner, or if we could do that with a second grader before they get that hormone surge that's going to make them feel crazy for a while. I mean, middle schoolers, they've got hormones going everywhere. High schoolers, they're feeling everything and don't know what to do with it. But if we could teach them to do it when they were little, hey, let's just take some breaths. Let's just calm down and let's just let our bodies feel how they feel and teach them that. Then me working with adults who are locked into that behavior, like I've felt this since I was 8 years old. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard people say, I think I felt this way my entire life. I just never really realized how anxious I was. We could knock that out so easily when we start teaching it in schools. And maybe it's just meditating. We go to recess and then we come back in and we take 5 minutes to breathe and to clear our heads out. And we teach kids how to do that. We teach them how to exhale. And then we go back and we do some social studies or some science for a while. And we keep going with our day.
I love that. And I also just thinking about how do you kind of reinforce these skills? So thinking about, okay, we just learned this new coping skill earlier this morning or yesterday. Johnny, like what experience have you had in the last day where you did something and you were proud of how you responded to it? Or maybe do you think that
Yeah.
you could have done this better? And actually like helping them reflect on their behaviors and like how it's connected to their emotions. And now my brain juices are going. And I'm also just thinking about all the implications, especially thinking about oftentimes, especially boys who turn into men who are part of marginalized groups. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's just the way life is right now.
Right.
But thinking about certain cultures where men are told that they're not allowed to feel that, being like all macho and tough and just explosive with their feelings is okay. And, guys just learn and grow up and not knowing how to actually process their emotions, but also differentiate their emotions from their behaviors and understanding that emotions are always valid, but understanding that certain behaviors in response to those emotions are not healthy.
Mhm. Yeah. And letting them know I just talked with someone, her name is Pam Covarrubias, and I talked with her last week. I actually met her on Threads, and she does a lot of coaching also on anxiety with the Latina community, and she was talking about her experience growing up, where I mean, especially in her culture, how we don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about, I'm sorry that you're feeling that way, but we're not going to talk about it because this isn't who we are as a people. We're not weak. We were like, she was saying, like, when someone looks at me, they see someone who was built for work. And if horses don't experience anxiety. And therefore, because I'm a worker, I also should not be able to express that, and how she was trying to unravel that herself, which I was like, oh my gosh, that's so much to have on your shoulders all the time. But I do think you're right. Like teaching these boys just to say, hey, can you name what you just felt? What was that emotion? Instead of bad. And we see this so much with adults. And I'll say, okay, well, just tell me how you felt. Like when you thought that, how'd you feel? I felt terrible. Yeah, but what did you feel? And we get so knotted up in bad or anxious. And yes, anxious is an emotion. But what I'm noticing is with so many people is that it's not just anxious. I feel small. I feel unheard. I feel frustrated. I feel weak. I feel all of these different other emotions that we just wrap up into this big mess that we call anxiety. And if we could say, hey, come over here and let's look at this, the emotion wheel. If we could just look at that and say, just look at this one and see which one of these seems most like you right now. And say, oh, yeah, that feeling that you're having, that's this. What do you want to do about it? Like, just, okay, well, that's just an emotion. What do you want to do about it? And I think just asking, being able to teach kids to say, what's going well for me right now? Because they're so quick to say, this isn't working. I didn't do well with this. This wasn't good. And not that teachers aren't trying to show them, hey, you did a really great job, but say, what do you feel like is working well right now? How was your day before school? What's good? And then say, okay, what's not going well or what didn't work? Let's just look at your day and say, what didn't work today? And then when they say what didn't work, we could say, okay, what do you want to do differently next time? And if what didn't work was that I got really mad at Billy at recess and I screamed at him and I tried to shove him because I was so mad, what do you want to do different next time? Okay, now you know. Next time we're going to practice this. And letting them just see, oh, when I feel that really big feeling, I don't have to freak out. It's the same way whenever I feel anxious, I don't have to get on and Google or try to control the next thing or criticize myself. It's just like, oh, wait, what's happening here? What do I want to do instead? Because we get stuck in that cycle of feeling anxious, going off the deep end with all of those anxious thoughts and believing the thoughts, then feeling more anxious, and then we think some more and then we feel some more and we just go around and around and around.
The one thing I think that boggles me is you think about learning a foreign language, and they say that you should start as young as possible because once you get to the age of like 9 or 10, it becomes harder to learn a foreign language. And I'm just wondering, is that the same with everything? And if it is, then why
Mm.
aren't we starting much younger with teaching these skills? Because we
Yeah.
grow up and we become adults and we just already have these autopilot reactions built in. And so we're not just trying to learn something, we're also trying to unlearn many things.
Yes. And then that process of unlearning is a lot harder than learning. It's so much easier to create a habit than to break a habit.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it like most kids learn, I mean, they learn the majority of their language and a lot of what they know by the time they're 5 years old. So maybe it's, maybe it's not certainly not high schoolers we want to look at. Maybe it's younger than that. Maybe it's primary grades. Maybe it's preschool. Maybe it's the parents so that the parents can start teaching their kids. But definitely, you're right. Unlearning is so much harder.
Hello, I am Kevin. I am the host of the Tyrant in Training podcast. It's a improv comedy podcast, and to help explain what exactly it is, I brought along my fiancée, Celine.
Hello.
Well done. Okay, Celine, what is the Tyrant in Training podcast about?
It is a podcast where you bring on guests and you ask them what they would do if they were ruling their own country, and you ask a bunch of fun questions.
There's loads of questions like what would be the name of their island and what political scandal would they be involved in?
So here's what happened.
I don't know the words to Gangster's Paradise.
The money will go back to the homeless eventually.
Celine, laugh. Perfect. You can listen to the Tyrant in Training podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get podcasts. You can find Tyrant in Training on its website, tyrantintraining.podcast page. You can also find me online at Kev Ryan Person. Listen and wonder why am I interviewing these guests who have awful opinions.
You also struggled immensely with anxiety. And I think for you, there was like this key moment in third grade when you were learning about a person named Ryan White, where it kind of started for you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I was probably in sixth grade. Third grade was when I started noticing that I didn't feel good. And I think I didn't have any way to describe it other than my stomach felt sick. And I felt like I was going to cry all the time. And maybe it was hormones and maybe it was something I don't know. Like, I can't tell you what in the world got me to that place. I was always really sensitive. So maybe it was just being a highly sensitive person. I don't know. But I remember in fifth grade or sixth grade, I don't remember which, being in our little tiny school library, and we had all these books and I love to read, but a magazine article came out. It was probably Time magazine or Newsweek or something, but it came out and it was about this teenager who lived in Indiana, where I live, and he contracted AIDS. He was a hemophiliac. He contracted AIDS and he died. And at that point in time, I mean, it was the 80s and we didn't know a whole lot about it. It was kind of new. It was kind of a mystery. And it was one of those things that if you got it, you were a goner. And I remember this kid thinking he didn't do anything. He just was sick and got it and died. So I developed this really, really intense fear of that, like AIDS in particular at that point, because it was terrifying. And I felt anxious. My brain went into overdrive and I just assumed that anything at that point, I was so triggered by this one magazine article that it was anything that people would say that someone would die from. I immediately thought I was going to get it or that I already had it. And it just spiraled into this years and years and years of health anxiety for me, where I was trying to explain this to my mom at one point, not even maybe just a couple of years ago. And I've been in pretty solid recovery now for about 8 years, but it was no. It was just last fall where I was like, the best way I could describe it to you is misinterpreting every single signal your body could give you as something that will kill you. It's just like not being able to read your body's signals as normal body feelings, but just assuming that there's something awful. And when you're in that place where you're incredibly anxious, your brain is constantly misreading your body. Your body feels anxious. Your brain assumes that you've got it just makes up a story. about what could possibly, everything that could possibly be wrong. And mine always went straight off the deep end. So yeah, I just remember this one moment. I can tell you exactly where I was sitting in this building that's no longer there. And reading that article and thinking, we're all going to die from this. Like, this is it. This is going to happen to me. And I really thought I was probably the only person that ever had that reaction to that article. It was really intense for me, but it was funny. One of the girls that I work with her now, and she and I were talking, and I was telling her we were talking about this situation that had come up, and she said, "Oh my God, but do you remember like Ryan White?" I'm like, that was like the defining moment in my entire anxious life. And she said, "Me too," because there was a magazine when we were in elementary school. I'm like, "Shut up, you read the magazine too." But she had the same reaction and nobody talked about it. I never knew that. I've known her since I was 6 or 7 years old. I never knew that. But we all did it alone.
How did you navigate those anxious moments throughout the rest of your childhood, adolescence? I'm sure they probably followed you into adulthood, just not having someone to talk about it. Because like you said, people just didn't talk about mental health. It wasn't, I think it should be its own kind of pandemic in a way. And I'm so glad that it's getting more visibility today. But, I think people were afraid of it. People didn't understand it back then. So how did you kind of go through different coping mechanisms and kind of survive your childhood with all of those anxious thoughts?
I stayed anxious from 3rd grade until I was almost 40. I'm 48. So I, during that time, just developed a lot of really, really bad coping skills that I thought were helping me. They felt good in the moment, which most of us do. We get that little quick bit of relief and it feels good, but it's actually keeping us stuck and making us more anxious. So, my biggest one was that every time I had a scary thought, I called my parents and I cried. And this was one of those things where when I was in college, I was a wreck. It was probably one of the hardest times of my entire life. And so I was at school, I was away, and I would call my parents sometimes twice a day, sobbing, like, "No, I'm telling you, like, I think I have this horrible disease. I think I'm dying. I don't know what to do." And so that was one way, was that I would call my parents and cry. One of my best friends from middle school and high school, her dad was my doctor. So God bless him. He helped me more than anyone, because I felt like I could trust him. So if I could ask him and he would say, "No, everything is okay." He was a doctor and he knew, but it was never enough to make me actually never think about it again. So I just would go through periods, sometimes that would last for 3 or 4 weeks, where I would hyperfixate on what I was terrified about and I would feel really anxious. And then maybe I would get a couple of weeks where I felt pretty good. And I would go out and have fun. It was very, very high functioning. I mean, I went to college, I got married, I had 4 kids, I raised my kids. I did all of these things and felt terrified probably 80% of the time of anything scary that popped into my head. And I guess what I didn't know, and why I don't know why this never occurred to me, was that I don't have to, even though there were other people, they would say things and I wouldn't necessarily believe them. Or I could say, "Oh, I'm just joking," or something like that. I never really actually sat down and realized that I did not have to believe everything that I thought. And I had this really interesting, I'm just going to call it an epiphany. I don't know what else to call it. I was taking a walk. I was probably right around 40 years old. And I told you I have 4 kids and I just needed a break. So I'm like, "Hey, I'm going to take a walk." And I was listening to an audiobook. And one of the things that they said in this audiobook was, anxiety is wishing for what you don't want. You do not have to believe everything you think. You can choose your thoughts. It was along the line, this idea of choosing your thoughts. And I'm like, that is not true. You cannot choose your thoughts, because I would never have chosen the things that I thought. I thought it was a total lie, but there was something about that. I'm like, but what if it's not? What if it's not true? And in this whole time where I had just believed every single thought that had popped into my head because it made me feel anxious and it felt very important. And so I did. That's what I did. I mean, I prayed like my life depended on it. And I thought, well, I can't even get that right. Obviously that obviously I can't even pray right because that's not working. And I was like begging, but it all went back to me constantly going back to check and see if I was anxious and to make sure I wasn't dying. And every time I did that, whether it was because I Googled something on my computer or because I asked my parents or I called my doctor, it was me putting more energy and more thought into how I felt and what I was afraid of, instead of realizing that I feel anxious. I've felt this at least 10,000 times by this point, and I'm fine. And what if that's not true? I never, ever got to the point where I could ask myself, what if it's not true? And that choice of saying, I don't have to believe that, was the first thing that actually made a difference for me. And it's progressed since then, where I've gotten to the point where I'm like, oh, I feel this. And now I can cut off my thoughts before I ever even go down that rabbit hole most of the time. But really, it was just anything I could to make it feel better for even 20 minutes was amazing.
You remember the name of that book?
I do. It was You Are a Badass. That's all it was. It had absolutely nothing to do with anxiety. Nothing to do with anxiety at all. I mean, it was a whole separate book on like coaching and business building. I wasn't a coach when I read this book either. I wasn't a coach. I didn't know anything about manifestation. I didn't know anything about any of this. I think I picked it up because I had never felt like a badass in my entire life, because I was so anxious, and because my brain in that moment was so focused on anxiety. That's what I got out of the book. That got me from wanting to, like, having this idea that I was getting to a point where I wanted to be out of the classroom and that I was done with that portion of teaching, to getting me to a place where I'm like, wait a minute, this is a lot more than just figuring out how to do whatever the book was about. It did not hit for me in that area, but it totally flipped the switch on anxiety for me. And I'm like, everyone in the world should have to read this book.
Okay, well, it's getting added to my bucket list.
I made my kids read it. It's so bad. I'm like, listen, you can be a badass too. Just read this book.
I love that you found almost like mindfulness coping mechanism where you were able to tell yourself, I don't have to think these thoughts. This is not true. And being able to get to a point where you could easily dismiss them. I think that's so incredible. And as a person who struggles with anxiety, I do that sometimes, and sometimes it works for me. Sometimes it's, I'm having a thought and I say, okay, this is just my anxiety. Let me not think about it. But then I immediately go, but what if this time it's true?
Oh, yeah. That's a tricky one, isn't it?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard, especially at night when I'm feeling like very restless and I just have all of these racing thoughts. And I try to do like the visualization of, hey, let me take this leaf and put it on this little sailboat and push it away. But then somehow the sailboat like decides I'm going to turn around and come back to you. And
yes. Yeah.
Do you have any tricks for kind of managing that when that does happen? Or and is that something that you had to deal with in the beginning too?
Oh, yeah. And it's something that, even though it's really, really simple, I mean, what I'm going to tell you, you're going to say, oh, okay. Like, it sounds way too simple, but simple and easy aren't necessarily the same thing, because brains are going to think. And when your brain has developed all of those habits of thinking everything that could be wrong, and it knows that if it pushes hard enough that you'll go back and entertain them some more, it's really, I like to describe your brain as a really dramatic teenage girl where everything is like the worst and you're going to die. So if you can picture that, where it's in there and it's just throwing everything at you to get you to do something, all it's doing is reading how your body feels. So if you can go into that really uncomfortable feeling, for me, it helps if I put my hand on it. So one of the things I do is I have people figure out where you feel it in your body and put your hand on that spot and take a breath into that spot and let your brain think whatever it wants. And so it's like, I can feel this and I know what it is because the feeling is concrete, right? Like, it's something that you can tangibly experience, even though it doesn't feel comfortable, even though it might feel tight, even though your brain is still thinking. and you set a rule for yourself. And it can even be a mantra. As long as I feel this feeling, I'm not allowed to believe anything I think. My brain came up to this. That was really, really scary, but I'm not allowed to believe it because I still feel that feeling. That feeling is still there. That thought doesn't count either. I know I feel like I need to do it. I know my what if happens. What if thoughts are always creative thoughts. And your brain is a creative thinker. So when you're in that place, it's being very creative and very dramatic to get you to solve a problem. But the problem is creative thinking. And even further than that, if you can go into that feeling inside your body, there's always an element of truth in your body that knows that you're safe. So what you can do is you can learn to say, okay, I feel this. Does this feel contractive? Does it feel like something that is making me try and curl into a ball and hide? Does it feel tight? Does it feel like I need to escape? Or is it urgent? If it's any of those things, it's anxiety. If it feels like, oh, this feels really scary, but there's a teeny, teeny, very quiet part of me that feels like, but maybe not. It's just, then we can say, okay, there's your truth. And that takes practice. It's simple. It's about feeling your way out of it. But it does take practice. And it's really a practice of saying, I feel anxious, so I'm not allowed to believe anything that I think. If I still think that when I'm not anxious, then I can actually take the next step. I've had clients where I've said, you just need to keep a notepad next to your bed. If you wake up with an anxious thought, write it down and promise yourself you'll worry about it in the morning. There's something about moving it from your brain onto paper and putting it over there and say, if this is still a problem for me in the morning, I'll handle it then. Most of the time, we're like, oh, that's weird. I don't even know why I thought that. But just getting it out of your brain and writing it on paper can make it shut off for you.
I like that idea. I've never tried that myself.
Yeah, that's something that, especially if you're one of the people that will lay there and toss and turn and think about your day before you go to bed, journal for 5 minutes, write down, these are all the things that I'm thinking. This is what I'm going to worry about tomorrow. And then close the book. It's out of your brain. And the next morning you'll be like, I don't have time for this stuff. You just move on. I don't have time for any of this. But it obviously wasn't that big of a problem if you're not thinking about it and having to handle it the next day either. It just moves it out of your head, and putting it on paper is a great way to do it.
I used to be really, really, really bad. And there are still days where I have really bad anxiety episodes.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell that the tiny things that I've implemented have been helpful. And I've noticed that I don't believe that you can ever just holistically go after an entire problem. And so for me, it's being able to kind of go after individual issues as it relates to anxiety. And so I remember when I was 16, my parents were divorced. So my dad was flying us down, me and my sisters down to Florida, and we were going to go to Disney World. I just remember my mom like constantly saying, she was like, if you have any negative feeling at all in your gut and your chest, do not get on that plane. You are not allowed to get on that plane. You call me and I will come pick you up and you won't go to Florida. I just remember like just being 16 and just, I was like, I'm the oldest. I need to take care of my little sisters and make sure we all get to Florida safely. Like, how do I know what feeling is like the feeling? And like, how do I know that, I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling nervous right now, but is that it? Is that my gut telling me that I shouldn't get on this plane because it's going to crash or it's going to, be taken over by a terrorist? Like, how do I know? And, thinking back to that day, I can't necessarily tell you how I sorted through those emotions or if I actually had a feeling or not, if I just try to kept myself distracted with other things. But, that kind of just like fear of flying kind of followed me, and not that it actually kept me from flying, but I remember for years, every time right before getting on a plane, I would have a panic attack. Taking off, I would be shaking and I could hear my heart racing and my chest was pounding. And it wasn't until like we were safely like maybe 10, 15 minutes into the flight that I would finally start to calm down. Cause like, okay, the plane didn't blow up. No one's
Yeah.
taken it over yet. But, I don't have panic attacks anymore when I fly. I fly my husband and I love to travel.
Yeah.
And so, it doesn't follow me anymore. And, the thing that helped me get through it is one, when I was not flying and you just like a random day, just sitting at my kitchen table, I'm able to think, okay, people get into more car crashes than they do plane crashes or just, plane failures and all of that. So it was like, statistically, I'm safer in a plane. I'm a practical person. I'm a Capricorn, so I'm able to kind of make those connections, and that works for me. And I realize that logic doesn't always work, especially in the heat of the moment of anxiety. But the other thing too, that I think just ended up working for me is like, I love travel. I'm not going to stop traveling because I have this fear that pops up sometimes. And I was like, if by some slim chance something does end up happening, I'm going to get on this plane. Once it takes off, the plane takes off. There's nothing I can do about it. So just kind of understanding that this is what I have control over and this is what I don't have control over. And I can't change it. And I just need to let the things that I can't control right now, just let them go. And I was like, if something happens, hey, I went out doing something I enjoyed doing. And I had these grand thoughts of like this amazing vacation or travel experience I was going to have. But I was like, I'm not going to let that hold me back anymore.
That's a power move. I love that. Yeah. And it's funny that you even brought that up, because my guess is that that flight that you were going to take to Florida to see your dad, that was mom's anxiety, because I used to call my parents every time they would go somewhere and say the exact same thing to them. Do not get on the plane if it feels scary. Like if you feel anything wrong, do not get on the plane. I told my parents that, but that was my anxiety, not theirs.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much of that was just something that came because mom loves you. She was trying to keep you safe. So you just adopted it as, oh, that's something I should be afraid of. Because you're right. Like anxiety is never rational. Right? If it's rational, we deal with it and it goes away. But when we have those constant thoughts, it's not. And it's so now that you're like, well, you know what? If I ever want to go anywhere, I'm going to have to fly. I guess that's a heck of a way to go down. That's a normal thought, right? I mean, we know there's that chance. It's an inherent risk. Like living is dangerous. And so for you to be able to say, nope, that's a risk I'm willing to take. There's no anxiety in that. There's just like I'm good.
Hi, my wonderful goat fans. Thank you so much again for tuning in. You all are truly the best. If you are enjoying this episode and all the incredible people and stories we showcase on this show, I'd like to ask you to consider supporting us in 2 other ways. 5-star ratings and reviews tell platforms like Spotify and Apple that you find this content valuable and that others may too, meaning they're more likely to show it to future listeners. Secondly, we are now on Patreon, and for just $3 a month, you can help me to continue to source incredible guests and independently produce this show. Visit patreon.com/notyouraveragegoat to consider joining us today. Again, thank you so much for being one of our greatest of all time fans.
How did you actually get started? Like, what motivated you? It sounds like that book was probably helpful, but was there any kind of other defining moment that helped to motivate you and say, hey, I'm going to become a coach. I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to help people work through this just like I had to work through on my own?
For me, when I told you that I knew that I could always teach people whatever, like I knew I was a good teacher, but I also, I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do forever. So I was kind of looking for a what's next. And I didn't know that even life coaching was a thing until I had read that book. And I'm like, oh my God, I could totally do that. Like, I know I could do that. And so seriously, I am one of those people that when it comes to making big decisions like that, like if I'm going to change from doing teaching to something else, I'm going to overthink it into the ground. It's like, I will think about it far too long and I will hem-haw over money and all the things like, should I really invest in this? Should I do that? And I went home and I looked up how to become a coach. And so I Googled it and I went probably to the first sponsored post that was on Google and I read about it. And I'm like, I signed up for a call. I'm like, tell me all about it. I want to know what it is. And that evening, my husband came home from work and I'm like, hey, I'm going to sign up for this program and it's going to cost this amount of money and I'm going to do this. And he looked at me, he's like, yeah, you should do that. I really I think I asked him because I wanted him to tell me no. But I was so excited about it that I'm like, seriously, you don't care? And he's like, no, I think you'd be really good at it. And so I signed up for it. That was my really dramatic thing. I signed up for it, admittedly, not even knowing exactly what it was that I like. Okay, I'm not really exactly sure how coaches do what they do or exactly even what they do, but I'm 100% positive I can be really good at this. That's how I went into it. And then it was also the first time where I was like, and this is something that I am going to stick with. Like it was never we'll see how it goes thing for me. It was like, I knew it was going to be hard. I had no background in business. I had no background in how to do any of this. And I was like, no, I'm going to figure this out. Like I have people, my brother is brilliant with like, he can help me. My dad can help me. Like all these people can help me. And everybody in my family was like, oh my God, yeah, do that. Like they were like, yes, for sure. You should be in this. So that's really how I started. And I started out as a health coach because I got my health coaching certification first. And I started out helping people figure out how to eat better because people would ask me, what do you eat? And I was like, well, that's a weird question, but I already knew how to do it. Like, so that's how I started, but there was nothing fulfilling in that for me. And at one point I was working with a coach and I hired her to help me get more of my business mindset right. She was somebody that I was like, I don't necessarily understand the business portion. I need somebody to help me with that. Education, you don't have to try to recruit your own students. They just come to you. The government sends them. So I needed to know how to do that. And at one point she's like, why in the world are you doing health coaching? And I was like, well, I don't even know what I told her. It was something stupid. And she's like, no. You just told me all the reasons about how you used to be anxious, how this used to be a part of your life and you're not doing that. Why are you not coaching people on that? And my immediate thought was, I have no idea how to tell people to do that. And I spun in that for a while. I'm like, I don't know. Like, what if that doesn't work for them? I would feel terrible. That would be like a heartbreaking thing for me to tell someone that I could help them with anxiety and not be able to help them. And she's like, no, that's where you need to be. You need to figure that out. So I was like, okay, I'm going to coach someone on anxiety. And it didn't take very long before I'm like, no, like I can explain this. It didn't feel like something at that point in my life that I could explain clearly. But as soon as I put what I did into words and I adapt it, I feel like I'm always learning so much new stuff. And then I'm like, ooh, I'm going to try that. So the next time I feel anxious, because let me just say right now that if anyone ever tells you that you're never going to feel anxious again, they are lying to you. I still get anxious. It does not take me down for weeks and weeks like it used to make me. I mean, there are times when I'll feel really anxious, but I'm not out of control. I have not had a panic attack or even an anxiety attack in 8 years. And it's not because, it's not that I don't ever feel anxious though. There are some times when I feel really anxious and I have to go back and I use the exact same things I teach other people. I'm like, I got to sit here and feel this and say, wow, that thought felt really important. And I'm kind of feel like I'm freaking out, but I'm safe and it goes away quickly. And it gets to the point where you're like, oh yeah, that's not a problem. So it really was just a process of me helping other people like me, I guess. And that's how I got here.
What's so special for you about More Than Anxiety podcast that you do?
You said you're an introvert and I'm also very introverted. Like I have to recharge a lot, but I'm also one of those people where if I was at, I don't know, for example, if I was at church on Sunday and somebody was like, hey, Megan, could you come up here and like talk about something for a while? I'd be like, absolutely. So, yeah, I can talk about anything. It's probably from teaching for so long that I'm like, sure, I can do that. I don't get nervous. I really like it. And, it was just something that along the way, I really was like, that seems like something that I would really like to do. I just decided it sounded fun, I guess. And it was. it was just something that was really fun for me. And I knew it was going to be about anxiety, but I also knew that I had a lot of other things that I wanted to talk about. I talk about anxiety in almost every single episode, but there are so many people with so many great things to share out there that can relate to people who also feel anxious, because everybody does. That it had to be about more than anxiety. So that's how it got its name. That's how it happened. It was just like, that would be really fun.
Folks who don't have anxiety, who might say things like, and I'm sure you've heard this before, oh, just stop being anxious. Just stop worrying. Do you have any tips or advice to kind of address some of the stigma or the misconceptions for people who don't have anxiety about anxiety?
That's a good one. It goes back to that when you don't know, or you don't know what you don't know, right? Like we want to say that, and I know they mean well, because from the outside, even as somebody who does have anxiety, we can look at, like, when we're calm and we see someone else who's anxious, we're like, no, you're fine. Like, from the outside, they're looking at us, and maybe they've never had that experience where they're anxious, but when they haven't had that feeling of, I can't interpret what's happening inside my body right now, and it feels so real and so important, they don't get it. So when they're saying it's the worst advice anybody could ever give you is just calm down, because obviously if you could, you would. But for someone who's listening who doesn't understand, if I could just say, I'm grateful that you don't understand, but understand that you don't understand. And the best thing you can do is sit with them and say, I believe you that you don't feel good, but I don't believe what you're thinking. Like, I believe you that this feels real, but I just want you to know I don't believe what you're thinking right now. And you don't have to either. I'm going to sit here until you feel better, and then we can talk about it. But until you feel better, I'm just going to sit here and believe you that you feel terrible. Because really, anxiety is a feeling, and the thoughts are just symptoms. The way that your body feels is a symptom. I mean, your body feels anxious. Anxious is an emotion. It's a chemical reaction inside your body. It's adrenaline and cortisol and all these other hormones doing their thing. And then your brain kicks in and it starts to think. It's just a biological process that is totally safe. Nothing's going to happen, but it feels important. So whether you are feeling your body and thinking you're about to have a heart attack, or you're feeling your body and thinking that it's because somebody, is trash talking you at work, whatever your thoughts are, your thoughts can ping pong all over the place, but it's really the feeling. So if the person who doesn't understand why you are thinking the things that you're thinking, maybe if they can just understand that it feels really true and really scary, and then just sit with them until the feeling goes away without telling them, just relax, because they're trying. Also, another thing that's really important, and I know a lot of times people will say, just breathe. And I'm like, no, because we're already breathing. Everyone's breathing. That's not the problem. The problem is that we're not exhaling. And that when you're really anxious, we tend to hold our breaths, or we tend to breathe very shallowly. If you can picture the air going in your nose and going down to maybe the top part of your chest. We're not breathing deeply because we're not exhaling. So if you can get someone who's really, even to the point where they're in a panic place, and just say, I need you to exhale with me. Watch me. We're going to exhale together. And you exhale and you push that air out until you feel like you are a deflated balloon. If you can imagine sucking air out of a balloon until it's squashed flat, if you can do that, get them to do that a couple of times, and then slowly breathe in, hold their breath, and then exhale again all the way out until they are squished as flat as a pancake. You're going to flip their nervous system so that they come out of that fight or flight state quickly. And then you can say, okay, let's sit here for a minute and just breathe. That's so much more helpful than saying just relax and breathe.
Well, Megan, we're almost finished. There's one question that I love to end every episode with. So the show is called Not Your Average Goat. Goat standing for greatest of all time. So sports metaphor. I'm a big sports person, especially football. So thinking about like Abby Wambach or Tom Brady or like
Yeah.
LeBron James, like all of these folks who are called goats. I
Yeah.
believe that there are so many people out there who the world doesn't know about, and they are your not average goats. And so that's why I bring people like you on this show. And so I love to ask to find out from you who or what, maybe like an experience or a milestone, has been your goat or biggest inspiration in life.
For sure, my dad. And I think my grandma. Yeah. Who are very different people. So, I mean, really, I was lucky to one of my grandmothers was 99 when she passed away, and the other grandma was 88. So, I was lucky to have my grandmas both into my 40s, which was amazing. And my dad, you know, we have wine every Friday. So I think that they are both very, even though neither of them understood how I felt, they were both very non-judgmental and tried to be supportive in something that they absolutely did not understand at all. My grandma, in a way that I don't even think that she could comprehend what I was saying, but she was just rock solid in terms of, like, I spent a lot of time with her. I just got a lot of faith from her and a lot of, this is how we love people, from her. And my dad, in a way where he may understand anxiety, but not in a way that I did. My dad's a Vietnam vet, and he had some big stuff, right? Like that was a really, really hard thing that we still don't really talk about in my family, but I saw him handle it with so much strength and grace and just honesty about, I'm not really going to talk about that with anyone. Like, that's just not what I'm going to do. And so when I would get really anxious, I knew I could believe anything I really believed anything my dad would tell me, and probably still believe more than I should ever believe when my dad tells me things. Because sometimes now I'm like, that is not freaking true at all. But he was so believable because I knew he cared about me, and my mom too, of course. But my dad, I would call him, and in this place when I was so anxious and I didn't know what else to do, I knew that if my dad would tell me that I was being stupid, like, Megan, this is just ridiculous, that I would be like, really? Okay. And it would make me feel better, which was so backward. But he would do it in such a loving way where I'd be like, Dad, will you just tell me I'm being stupid? And he's like, are you kidding me? Okay, you're being stupid. Did you want me to tell you that? But he was always the one that he would call and be like, okay, are you okay now? And then he would tell me a joke, or he would tell me a hilarious story, and he could find ways to like divert me around it. He just has a very creative way of thinking about things. And he could say, instead of thinking about it this way, let's think about it this way. And that was really helpful for me to hear him be able to rephrase things like that, but also just to see his strength in handling really big situations too, where I'm like, my dad really came from nothing. Like he grew up in a house with a dirt floor, and he made so much amazing stuff happen in his life. Just, I think, just out of his goodness and his willing to help other people. That was really kind of the foundation of who he was. So I think that my dad and my grandpa, and my dad and my grandma.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Megan.
Yeah.
If folks want to get in touch, follow your work, how can they find you and connect?
I'm kind of everywhere. You can find me on Threads, or you can find me on Instagram, or even on Facebook. And it's Coach Megan Devito, all one word, no underscores or anything. Just so Coach and then my name. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and that, I believe, is just under Megan DeVito without the coach part. So any of those places, my DMs are always open. So anyone is welcome to message me if they have questions, if they want to learn more about how they can work with me, reach out and let's find time just to chat. We can jump on the phone and talk about what's going on and what do you think and how would you rather feel? I think that's an important thing, to try and stretch your brain to imagine what it's like when you don't feel anxious. It can feel really impossible when you're in that place for a long time, but that's a great place to start.
Yeah. So what would you rather feel? I love
that. What would you rather feel? See if you can get your brain to go there. Usually the answer is not anxious, but what else?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Megan. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I just appreciate all the insight and, just authenticity that you've shared this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed this.
Not Your Average Goat is produced and edited by yours truly, with music by Sergey Quadrado and Anton Blazov. All content is copyrighted and should not be recreated, reproduced, or reused without explicit consent. Please visit notyouraveragegoat.org/contact for questions.